You know, it's interesting places like this that just make you want to sit back and think about what you can do about these sorts of things. I mean, what I'm looking at right now, this would be a great racetrack for SRVs. We call it the Bull. Uh, there has been a lot going on, and I haven't necessarily uploaded, but shrug. I'm still working on committing to an actual upload schedule. Would have recorded this earlier, but I forgot it was update day. Oh. But I think today's session is going to be about something that I have been thinking on for a bit of a while and have wanted to do a little bit of a video based on what I have seen. Communism. Can it work? The idea of a nation governed strictly by the people. I'm sure we all know about the whole, workers' revolution thing that communism espouses, and I have seen a few videos on what it is. To clarify, as far as I am aware, communism espouses that the riches of a nation belong belong to its people. It is the people that work to get the resources out of the ground, so it is them who should own it. I think the basis we're looking at here is that of a community. If you think about it, by the first video we broke down how racism necessarily works. In this particular case, I would break down communism itself into two parts. Commune, or commune, or community, and ism. Now, I know we said ism itself is prejudice to and against individuals, but in this particular context, it has a different meaning. In this case, ism is style of government. We share the same thing along the lines of capitalism, so to speak. So you have style of government on the basis of the community. Now, one thing I want to point out to people who are against communism, mainly because of its history, so on and so forth. I mean, I think we all can agree that nations that have governed by communism are not necessarily long-lasting. And in the very cases, the standards of living in those nations that are in communism is very poor, at least for the people that are supposed to govern it. That is the worker class, people who are underneath the middle class, so to speak. I look at communism, and yes, it has a bad history. But the ideals are attractive. Why are they attractive? Mainly because they are attractive to individuals who do not yet have their own establishment in the world. Case in point, look at the older generations who have actually lived through communism and have experienced it firsthand in this particular instance. Especially, even the older generations who haven't been through it. The fact remains is that they have their resources. They have secured what they need to in order to live out the rest of their lives. And that, I think, is the ultimate goal of humanity in a nutshell, at least on our base instincts, is to secure the resources needed to live out one's life, pass on their genes, and then die. I mean, that's just life. And then you have the individuals who are the younger crowd, the ones who are in college. They don't necessarily have that foothold. They are effectively in that in-between place where they're they're still finding their way. They don't have their own resources, and what little resources they do have, it's difficult for them to really get their feet under them. Case in point, you can look at it the same way as if you are playing a survival crafting game. You know, things like Minecraft, Starbound, Terraria. I personally like Terraria. That one's my favorite. When you first start off, you have next to nothing, and surviving is difficult. That's what it's like for the younger individuals who are reaching the end of their high school days and beginning their college age. It's essentially at the age where they are effectively supposed to leave the nest. They are supposed to be independent, no longer dependent on their parents to provide for them. They are expected to provide for themselves. And yeah, when you're first starting out and you don't have that many resources to you, life sucks. It's gonna suck. It's gonna be hard. You're not gonna be able to make much money. You're gonna be, barely able to keep hold of yourselves. And I think that's something the older generation may have forgotten. In some cases, they may, espouse, you have it easier than I did. Back in the day, I would walk to school uphill in the snow both ways with no shoes, that sort of thing. Yeah, I get it. Life sucked when you were younger. And now that you're older, you have those resources, so life doesn't suck as much. And a lot of the older generation are attempting to put away resources to make life for their offspring better. We see this in the case of grandparents putting money away in trust funds for their kids, their grandkids to go to college. The middle class, they say you go to college, get a good job, and you can make it like I did, that sort of thing. The interesting thing there is that even with these safety nets, life still sucks for the college aged individual because resources are still thin. They're still working out where they want to be in life and everything, and they have to kind of prioritize survival first. So then we bring in communism. Communism promises equal share for everybody. Life's going to get better because everybody has equal access to all the riches. And a lot of people bring up the points, like billionaires, do they really need that amount of money? I think that's a question that I can look at and go, do they really need that much? It's a valid question. Because I remember reading an article before all the media just lost their goddamn minds and started espousing this whole diversity sort of thing. And the article itself talked about how to maintain happiness, all you really need is about $75,000 a year. That's it. Yeah, everything else is just gravy after that point, and you're just living the decadent life. And I look at it and I think to myself, that doesn't really sound like all that much. And I have personally been surviving on far less than that. But I suppose, I'm single, no kids. And that's pretty much probably how the rest of my life is going to be. Kind of lost out on that end. It's a topic for another time. But still, getting a hold of those resources is hard. And then you look at communism, which promises equal pay for equal resources for everybody. Nobody has to suffer. And people look at it and go, hey, that sounds pretty good. You know, my life sucks right now. I don't have as much resources, and communism promises that I will not suffer. That's the theory. It's a nice theory, but it doesn't really work in practice, and we've seen the results of such and why. Here's a thought experiment for you in this particular instance. So we'll say that an individual has a specific job and it pays them $1,000 a week. And then you look at another individual who has a different job and it only pays them $500 a week. Now, barring all the rest of these diversity issues and nitpicks about, specific appearance things, different color, skin tone, different sex, throwing all that aside. I mean, hell, you could even say it's a job, they have two different jobs in the same company, but they pay differently. Under communism, the person who only gets $500 a week would look to the person who's making $1,000 and say, hey, that's not fair. This is communism. I want equal, everything should be equal. So the person who is paying $1,000 now only gets $750 because the government stepped in and said, we're reallocating your riches, and you got to give money to this other individual who's earning less than you are. And he can't really say too much about it. So both of them are earning $750 a week. So the person who's earning $1,000 can't necessarily live a higher lifestyle. He's got to kind of scale back a little bit. But the person who is earning less says, this is pretty good. I'm working, the same as this individual, but I'm making more money than if I was doing it my own job. Now, we're going to say something happens, and the person who is making $1,000 lost his job. He got fired for something, or the company had to reduce overhead, or, the job was outmoded, effectively defunct, obsolete. So he doesn't work anymore. So he stops working, and he stops earning that $1,000 a week flat. He can now turn around and say to the other individual who is taking his share of the money and say, I'm not working anymore, I'm not getting paid, so now you have to share your money with me. So now the person who had $500 a week is now used to be earning $750 because of the other individual, except he's no longer working, so his net income is zero. So the individual with $500 is now suddenly earning less. First he was earning $750 above his usual $500 grade. Now he's earning less because the government steps in and says, yeah, you're making too much money. So instead of earning $750 or even just $500, he's now only earning $250 a week. And the other person who lost their job is effectively earning $250 a week doing nothing. Now I know some people look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair. Yes, that is fair. That is the hard, cold mathematics that communism goes by, in theory. So if you're one of the individuals who advocates for communism and you're earning less, sure, it looks good when you're taking away from the people who make more than you. But what if the people who have more than you suddenly lose access to that income? Now suddenly you're the breadwinner. You're the one whose wealth gets taken away. Under a capitalistic system, you may not be getting that extra $250 a week, But that also means if that other person suddenly loses access to that money, you're suddenly not losing, $250 a week. You're still making that $500. Too bad, so sad. And that incentivizes the other person who lost that job to go find another one. This is why communism doesn't necessarily work in practice, is because it incentivizes people to do nothing and still make money, if we're talking in the financial sense. And the interesting thing that we can necessarily bring up to this is the experiment of mouse utopia. If you haven't looked that up, it's a whole experiment thing that was done. Universe 25 itself was the big one there. The mice were effectively given everything they could ever want, and they were expected to just grow the population exponentially. And at first, it looked like it was going well. But about after the third, fourth generation, there were signs that the society was collapsing. The food wasn't different, the environment wasn't different. It was perfectly calculated to be a sheer utopia for mice. All the basic needs were met. And still it collapsed. And people, wondered why. And, what few people know is that the experiments continued beyond Universe 25, which is the most well-known one. And the person who was conducting these experiments, later on in one of the future universes, realized what was going on. And that he needed enrichment for the mice. Beyond all the basic needs were met. There was no challenge in survival. They still needed some kind of mental stimulus to really make life worth living. And the populations that received that stimulus in the future experiments did much better and lasted far longer than Universe 25. So, I think it really kind of explains why communism necessarily keeps falling flat on its face in this instance. If everybody's basic needs are met, and there is no challenge in survival, what do you do with yourselves? What is my purpose in life? The human asks, looking for a reason to exist. And this is where religion kind of kicked in. The whole using gods to explain natural phenomena sort of thing. And the humans figured that if they did things to appease these gods, they could abate these natural phenomena. And they found purpose in this. Doesn't matter how, useless it was in that particular instance. It doesn't matter that there was completely natural phenomena that science could later explain. Humans found a purpose in playing pretend. I mean, to them, it certainly wasn't pretend, but, looking back on it from a modern perspective, it's certainly what they were doing. And I suppose this is the argument that individuals that are against religion would make. But at the same time, you gotta look to those atheists and you gotta tell them, okay, if not serving a higher purpose, even if it's false and it doesn't really exist, what else do we exist beyond survival for? I think that's a question I necessarily want to challenge atheists on this particular instance, and I want them to get their answer. Because again, assuming that there is no challenge in survival, what is the purpose of life? Because at its base form, the purpose of life is to exist, procreate, and then pass on. Beyond that, just having the resources you need to ensure that, that's it. And, this is where the whole nihilistic viewpoint comes into play. What's the point in life? There's really nothing to it anymore. We should all just accept our deaths and move on and not bother to leave any sort of mark that we were here, because we'll just be forgotten in like 2 generations anyway. Anyway, I'm getting off topic about this. Communism itself, the thing I really wanted to touch on was the spirit of communism. The spirit of communism itself is alive and well in the US today. What I mean by this is go take a look at small town USA. And I'm talking about any of the dozens upon hundreds of towns in your state that frankly don't really exist unless you really go looking for them. Like if you were to talk to somebody who doesn't live in the state and you told them the name of a town in that state that you knew about, and it's like not one of the big metropolises that's fairly well known, or it's had any issues with it. Even other Americans are going to look at you and like you're crazy and say, "That's a real place." Yeah, I've seen this. I've got family that lives in a town with a population of 10. That's it. But getting to the point of small town USA, when you live in a small community about that size, it's easy for people to personalize those experiences. It's easy for them to personalize each other, to put names to faces and understand the personal stories of those individuals, what they grew up, what they saw, why the way they are, that sort of thing. Everybody knows everybody. And in those small communities, this is where the spirit of communism is alive and well. In times of prosperity, you got people that share with each other freely, willingly, to ensure that that there is no real suffering in this community. Everybody's happy. Everybody's got everything they need. And when times are tough, neighbors pull together to get through the tough times. And when everything is good, they throw celebrations and everybody is invited, and it's one big giant block party. When you have that level of connectivity on a personal level, the spirit of communism in and of itself is easier to achieve, ensuring that the community looks after itself and is well cared for. Now, let's look at what happens if we bump the population up. A YouTuber by the name of Alan Paladin does a whole lot of long form videos on psychology and whatnot. And one thing that she touched on in one of the studies, I can't remember what video it was, I can't remember what study it was, but the thing they touched on is that humans can only make personal connections up to about 150 individuals. Beyond that, you start losing those personal details. They start becoming a sea of faces. So the bigger the community, the more likely you're not going to have that personal connection with individuals on the lower end of things. Especially so when you start getting to the size of cities. You start getting to a city-sized population of 300 plus, and you can't keep track of everybody. It's impossible to keep track of everyone if this study is correct of their personal connections, personal histories. You start losing that connection. And when that happens, you start to get a sense of, why should I care, about people that I don't really know? And you can see this happening in the cities, is that when you kind of get to a mid-sized city, you start seeing more of the homeless population. The crime starts going up because not everybody is able to attain those resources. And it's less sharing everything and caring about other people and more looking out for yourself. Not necessarily out of any sort of malicious intent, but because it's just not possible for you to keep up with the personal connection of that many individuals. And let's not even get into the metropolises with 10,000 plus. All the big famous ones: New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Charlotte, Chicago. Yeah, I know, I'm naming a lot of places that sound like shitholes. But that just makes my point, is in that when you've got that many people, You can't keep up with those personal connections of all those people. They understand their stories, where they came from, the families that they are with. And when that happens, it's less a community and more about the individual, ensuring your own survival, looking out for number one before you look out for your neighbors. And then you might, in these bigger cities, they definitely have the smaller neighborhoods, like the New York City itself, broken up into, I think, 5 or 6 different um, boroughs, so to speak, different neighborhoods, and they compete with each other in terms of pride and resources. You know, you walk up to somebody in, I think, like maybe Queens, and they'll talk shit about the Bronx, and then the Bronx will talk shit about Queens and somebody else in return. Yeah, that sort of thing. You kind of got that individualistic area like that, and then you got the local gangs in there as well that are trying to keep each other intact. They fight with each other and so on and so forth, because there is not that personal connection. We've seen a lot of feel-good stories, about people who are in the system, rivals who take the time to get to know one another on a personal level and realize we're not so different, you and I. So the more people you have in a community, the less that communism necessarily works well. Again, the spirit of communism is alive and well in small town USA, but as soon as you get to the bigger metropolises, you see it not work as well, because there isn't that personal connection that allows people to give willingly and freely. And if it doesn't work in a metropolis of 10,000 plus people, how the hell is it going to work as a form of government for 370 million? I'm ballparking. I don't really know the actual population of the U.S. and it's like 325 million, 375 million, somewhere in there. I know it's around like 4 million, somewhere in there. 300, 400 million. Derp. So why? And again, this also explains why communism itself is so popular, especially among younger people, is because it promises them the resources they don't have, that makes survival not as much of a challenge, as opposed to the older generations who have achieved that kind of survival stability and don't have to worry as much. Now, I'm fairly certain that there will be some people who will say that even in their older years, um, they still face challenges regarding their survival, but my point in that still stands, especially for those who keep talking about how hard they had it and how easy the younger generations have it in that instance. The one thing you gotta remember is that the younger generations are expected to stand on their own and not really get those kind of free handouts. Sure, getting people a good head start on life can be a good thing, but then at the same time, um, the point of getting to that age is being able to stand on your own 2 feet. Uh, Taking what you need to survive in that instance, finding your own source of resources. That's the challenge. And communism was believed to be a way to alleviate that. And again, the theory sounds nice, but in practice, it doesn't work so well. The spirit of it in small town USA is alive and well. And I doubt that there is, I bet there's very few people who would disagree with that. But when you start to increase the numbers and you lose that personal connection, it starts to break down. And when it does break down, that's when, the people in power have got to say, oh, well, shit's hit the fan. We got to clamp down on these things and ensure the survival of the nation. And that's when, the gulags start, the wrong thing starts, the persecution, the witch trials start, that sort of thing. So I would say, the spirit of it still works. It's a nice idea. And when you're able to work as a smaller community, um, and help each other out and that sort of thing, it's a beautiful thing. And that's usually what makes small town USA so popular, especially among the older individuals. Get away from all this high strung looking out for number one and finding communities that are able to personalize themselves, where everybody knows everybody, and when times are good, share in the bounty, and when times are tough, band together to get through the storm. But the reason why capitalism works on such a larger scale is because it caters to the individual, looking out for number one. And when you're not a person, but a statistic in the eyes of a nation, it works a lot better and it looks a lot better. Especially when you start having those resources and realizing, if the other party that you were relying on to produce for you is suddenly no longer producing, you're suddenly going to have to start paying out. It's that saying that's going around. Communism works until you start running out of somebody else's money. So I think that's where that necessarily comes from. It's a nice idea, and I can see why it's attractive. But at the same time, when you start losing that personal touch, it doesn't work anymore. When the goal is to look out for yourself because you are simply a face in the crowd and everybody else around you doesn't have that connection, you start to wonder why I should care. And some people can be swayed like that, easily persuaded. It's a persuasive argument. That's why we have charities and some things. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But when it doesn't really affect you as much because it's not personal to you, you're not as likely to participate in that sort of sharing of resources. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I mean, everybody is an individual, everybody's got to survive. There's really nothing wrong with looking out for number one. Which, I find this interesting. You would think that the individuals who espouse it would be for their smaller secular communities, especially the family, but the family is under attack with all this sexism nonsense running around. And again, I think that's a video for another time. But it's weird. I don't really get that either. But hopefully, you thought about what I had to say in this particular instance, and really, communism itself doesn't look that bad. But I would not implement it as a form of large government for a large number of individuals because it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that well that way. Or maybe I'm just screaming into the void again.